Today, we're diving into the epic story of Britain. I mean, think about it. A small, kind of restless island that somehow, against all odds, managed to build the largest empire in history. And in doing so, it pretty much shaped the entire modern world.
And that really brings us to the huge question we're tackling. How on earth did that happen? How did this one island kingdom project its power across every single continent? And, just as important, why did it all seem to just go away? That's the journey we're going to go on.
So, to really get how Britain looked outward to build an empire, we first have to look inward. Our story has to begin with the forging of the nation itself, turning a totally fractured island into a single, unified state, which, let me tell you, took centuries of conflict and change.
You know, what's so fascinating is that early Britain was really defined by outsiders. First up, you had the Romans, leaving their roads and walls behind. After they packed up, Germanic tribes, the Angles and Saxons, settled in, which is actually where we get the name Angleland or England. Then the Vikings crashed onto the scene with, well, a lot of fire and fury. And finally, the big one, 1066, the Normans conquered the whole thing. The key here is that each wave didn't just conquer, they contributed something, building this new, unexpected culture layer by layer.
Okay, let's fast forward to the 1500s, because the kingdom's identity is about to get completely reshaped by a king's personal drama. When Henry VIII was denied a divorce by the Pope, he didn't just find a new wife, he created a whole new church. The Church of England gave the nation a really distinct Protestant character, but it also kind of left it isolated and vulnerable in a mostly Catholic Europe.
And that vulnerability was put to the ultimate test in 1588. Catholic Spain, the absolute superpower of the day, sent its massive armada to crush England once and for all. And against every expectation, the tiny island navy actually won. So this victory wasn't just about survival. It gave England this incredible new swagger, this confidence that, hey, maybe it could take on the world.
And that new confidence found a much bigger stage, and pretty quickly. When Queen Elizabeth I died without an heir, the crown passed to her closest relative, King James VI of Scotland. So all of a sudden, you have one king ruling two separate kingdoms. This union of the crowns planted a really radical idea, especially since Scotland was in the middle of an economic crisis after its own colonial attempts had failed miserably.
Well, that idea finally became a reality in 1707. The Act of Union officially merged the kingdoms of England and Scotland, creating the United Kingdom of Great Britain. So for the very first time, the island was one single powerful state, and it was ready and able to turn all of its ambition outward.
All right, so with its own house finally in order, Great Britain was ready to look to the rest of the world. This brings us to part 2, where we're going to see how this newly unified kingdom kicked off a period of just explosive expansion, fueled by commerce, new technology, and a whole lot of military might.
There were really three key engines powering this whole thing. First, the Royal Navy. You could think of it as both a global shield that protected the island and a slingshot that projected its power abroad. Second, the East India Company, which is just a wild story. It was a private trading company that got so powerful it effectively conquered and governed India. And third, the Industrial Revolution, this wave of innovation that turned Britain into the workshop of the world.
And this is the basic economic logic of the empire. It was a simple but incredibly powerful cycle. You take raw materials like cotton from India or sugar from the Caribbean, ship them to Britain, process them in all the new factories, and then you sell the finished goods right back to the colonies and the rest of the world. This simple loop made London the financial center of the globe. But, and this is a huge but, this unbelievable growth came at an immense human cost. While Britain grew incredibly rich, the very policies that fueled its expansion often had just devastating consequences for the people who were living under its rule.
I mean, just look at these two stark examples. In Ireland, a potato blight wipes out the main food source for the entire population. But British policy kept exporting other food from the country, which led to mass starvation. And in Bengal, the East India Company forced farmers to grow cash crops like opium instead of food, leaving millions completely vulnerable when famine struck. It was a brutal calculation. Profit often came before people.
All that resentment eventually just boiled over. In 1857, Indian soldiers who were serving under British officers, they were known as sepoys, rebelled against the East India Company. Now, the spark was a rumor about rifle cartridges, but the fuel was decades of just simmering anger. The rebellion ultimately failed, but it was so shocking that the British government had to step in, dissolve the company, and take direct control of India. That's when Queen Victoria was officially made the Empress of India.
So,
Despite all these tensions, by the start of the 20th century, the British Empire had reached its absolute peak. At its height, the Union Jack was flying over 1/4 of the world's entire landmass, and Britain ruled hundreds of millions of people. It's where the famous saying came from: the sun truly never set on the British Empire.
But of course, no empire lasts forever. In our final act, we're going to see how the immense strains of 2 world wars led to the empire's rapid collapse. This forced Britain to find a totally new place in a world it no longer dominated.
Here's the great paradox of the 20th century for Britain. It was on the winning side of both world wars, but that victory came at a staggering cost. By 1945, the country had burned through its entire fortune. So yes, it was victorious, but it was also bankrupt. And the will and the wealth needed to maintain a global empire were just gone.
What followed was this incredibly rapid unraveling. In 1947, the jewel in the crown, India, gained its independence, splitting into India and Pakistan. This set off a huge chain reaction. Throughout the 50s and 60s, colonies across Africa and the Caribbean all became independent nations. And the whole process really came to an end in 1997, with the handover of Hong Kong, Britain's last major colony, back to China.
But as the empire was dissolving, something really unexpected took its place: the Commonwealth of Nations. It's this voluntary association of former colonies, now all independent states, that are linked not by force, but by a shared history, language, and certain values. It was a really remarkable pivot from being a ruler to becoming a partner.
So as its global role was shrinking, Britain turned inward and started building a new kind of society from the ashes of war. The shared trauma of the conflict in this search for a new national purpose led to some really ambitious social reforms. The most famous, of course, is the National Health Service, which promised free healthcare from the cradle to the grave, a whole new social contract for a new era.
And this search for identity is still going on today. The 2016 Brexit referendum revealed a deeply divided nation. And what's crucial here is that while England largely voted to leave the European Union, Scotland and Northern Ireland, with their own distinct histories and ties to the continent, both voted to remain. And this has reignited all these old questions about the very future and unity of the United Kingdom itself.
Which brings us to our final question. After centuries of building an identity as a unified kingdom, then an imperial power, and then a European partner, Britain finds itself at yet another crossroads. Its entire history is a story of constant and often turbulent adaptation. So the only real question now is, what comes next?